Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. This is day 5 of the spring 2022 Royce Fellowship presentations. We have 5 students who are going to go today, so we're going to get right into it. For those who don't know, the Royce Fellowship was established in 1996, thanks to the generosity of Charles Royce, class of 61, and it enables undergraduate students to engage in independent projects of their own design across the United States and around the world. We have 5 stellar examples of that today. We've had great conversations over the last 5 days. If you go to the program, you can see video recordings of those conversations. This conversation as well is recorded. I'm sure that today's conversation will be just as great as those. First up, we have Leela Berman, who is presenting on insurgency and counterinsurgency in the news, lessons from Seattle in the long 1960s. And we will save Q&A until the end of all the students' presentations.
Hi, everybody. I'm really excited to start us off today for what I'm sure is going to be an amazing round of presentations. I wanted to begin by telling a story that actually began exactly 52 years ago. I was really excited when I saw that those dates aligned. When police officers seized a truck carrying Black Panther Party newspapers in San Francisco, California. The Seattle chapter in their 4th ever bulletin wrote that the reason was that the police wanted to ensure that news of violent and brutal acts, murders that they had covered up, that had been reported on in the Black Panther newspaper would be silenced. And the Seattle chapter writes that this sort of intimidation is not going to stop them from their reporting, and that justice will eventually come. And I wanted to start with the story because I think it brings up a lot of the things that I'll be thinking about and talking about today, how reporting around movements shapes how we talk about them, and how that often happened in collaboration or direct opposition to the state, and how movements tried to define themselves, and how news and tactics of resistance and against state violence reverberated across cities and across the world. And with all these themes, I wanted to show my research question. I was really interested in investigating the role of media in shaping how people thought about radical movements in Seattle in the late 60s and 70s. And I was especially curious about, I think, these terms that get thrown around all the time: terror, security, national threat, emerged during the 60s and 70s, and the material effects they had on people who were doing organizing work then on their lives. And I think sometimes it's hard to know, exactly why this is relevant, especially when we're talking about like a hyper local context that, I'm not sure anyone would really know that much about unless they were also from Seattle. But honestly, even if you were, you might not. And I wanted to contextualize this work. So I'm from Seattle, and I became really interested in thinking about these questions during movements for justice and Black liberation during the summer of 2020, when I supported uprisings after the death of George Floyd. And a number of people I knew who weren't from Seattle asked me, Leela, what in the world is going on there? And I've highlighted one newspaper article from late in the summer from the New York Times that talks about the chaos in Seattle, the police vanishing, a city abandoning a neighborhood. And it was really clear to me how this language was really shaping how people I knew thought about this. And that this was just one example. That I've also included the National Strategy for Countering Domestic Terrorism put out by President Biden, which has gotten a lot of attention for the ways that it polices and surveils marginalized folks, as sort of the legacies of all these discourses of national security that emerged during the 60s and 70s. And I was really interested in this particularly because I think I've been taught in a lot of organizing contexts to see all news as good news. And that sometimes I think this couldn't be further from the case, especially as we sit with the origins of words like terrorist or radical and think about where they come from. And so I think that was the work that I really wanted to set out to do in an incredibly kind of local context, but to also think with how this local context could inform us about national and international projects of national security. And while studying the history of a city, I think it's really important to acknowledge where cities in the United States come from. Seattle, like all other US cities, forms out of settler colonialism and racial capitalism. It's on the lands of the Duwamish Nation, and it's actually named after Chief Sialsh of the Duwamish and Suquamish, in what is maybe the first, but definitely not the last, like attempt at kind of taking on multiculturalism as a way to ignore violence in Seattle history. It is a city of extreme wealth inequality, racial segregation, and hierarchies of labor, both historical and present. And I really see the 60s and 70s as a coalescing of so many of these histories of both resistance and violence and things that don't fit exactly into either one of these binaries, including the seizures of land by Indigenous people, rallies to protect Chinatown, the emergence of the Black Panther Party, and that all of this was happening within kind of a context of economic depression, because Seattle really relied on the production of military equipment during World War II. And so it actually played a huge role in sort of international projects of US empire, that I think is an important thing to sit with as we think about kind of all these many local histories. I also wanted to talk a little bit about my methodologies and practice. I worked pretty much exclusively with archival research this summer. I had hoped to be able to have a number of other conversations that ended up not panning out due to COVID safety concerns. And I think something I really grappled with was what it meant to be doing community engaged archive work, especially within mainstream traditional archives, including newspaper archives of highly circulated newspapers like the Seattle Times and Seattle PI, which I think really evidently show some of the silences and violences that exist within the archive. And so one of my main takeaways from the work is the importance of trying to share out not just takeaways from research, but also the actual materials with as many people as possible, so that archives don't really don't continue to be only accessible to like elite college students and other academics. And I also wanted to name that in this presentation, I focused primarily on a number of these mainstream articles and kind of picking apart what they mean and who they mean that for. Because I think in an academic context like Brown, in which knowledge is produced in really similar ways to some of these mainstream newspapers, that it's important for us to not tacitly accept the ways that newspapers talk about things like terror and security, and to instead remove some of their power by thinking about them as creators of discourse and propaganda. And so that's sort of a warning for what's about to come next, which is a bunch of headlines, not all of which are, I think, pretty. So I think one of the first things that became really obvious as I was doing this archival work was just how clearly terror in the United States was constructed to vilify freedom and liberation movements. There's a quote that I found that's cited in a number of articles from the time and now, in which they refer to Seattle as like the bombing capital of the nation during the time. And basically all these bombings were blamed on leftist organizations without any research into whether or not that was actually true. It was also, I think, really clear on this in this leftmost article, Terrorists Given Notice, how much there was sort of this tacit acceptance and celebration of a lot of the tactics of state violence used against radicals that really relied on marking them as terrorists, so that once you had positioned a radical as a terrorist, it was okay to surveil them, to police them, to incarcerate them. And I think the role that media plays in manufacturing that consent and inventing that reality is really important to note. And also that there were a lot of parallels drawn between what was going on within the United States and guerrilla warfare by liberation movements abroad. So to see local struggles as kind of intrinsically connected to international struggles is really important. And then one other thing that I thought was really funny was kind of this obsession with like white people becoming terrorists. That there were like lots of articles that were like, what's going on? Why are they becoming terrorists? Why are they engaging with these leftist projects? Why do they care about other people? And I think that was really like one of the through lines of very racialized reporting on terror that I saw emerge. So to go into that in a little bit more depth, I wanted to kind of highlight two particular trends in the portrayal of white radicals. The first was kind of how much care white radicals were given. The article on the left is of someone who set off a bomb and then was actually killed in that bombing. He was the only person harmed, and all the articles published about it focus on how he was such a good student, how he was so kind, and that sort of kind of forgiveness, was never offered to non-white and especially Black organizers and people, including those who had been murdered at the hands of state violence. And then I think the article on the right, I was particularly interested in this notion that if a radical could kind of blend or come back into society, that they weren't a part of society to begin with, marking radicals as kind of inherently foreign to US citizenship, but also the ability of white radicals to kind of be welcomed back with open arms. Whereas in representations of non-white movements, Native projects of resistance in Seattle, and kind of Black liberation projects across the world, and global projects for liberation, we see this language of foreigner, of terrorist. I think I particularly wanted to highlight this article on the bottom left, in which an Israeli expert during a time of heightened Palestinian resistance to Israeli apartheid says that terrorists are all alike. And I think one of the things that we can take away from this is both how deep the linkages of kind of international projects of security are, and the possibilities of solidarity against them that can kind of unite us across shared tactics of surveillance and policing that are used against us. And I think on this topic of solidarity, as I said before, I didn't want to share as much of alternative news within this academic context because I wanted to make sure that that was sort of more immediately accessible to people. But I did want to highlight this cartoon from the third bulletin of the Seattle Black Panther Party, because I think that it does a really striking job of showing how kind of this sort of newspaper and alternative information sharing doesn't just have to be about sharing like current events or what's going on or injustices that aren't being reported, all of which is important, but also that it can play a role in kind of the discursive, intellectual, and political work of defining these terms, naming these terms, recognizing who people are, how people are being reported on and why. So this comic really brings home the idea that the Black Panthers were being treated as a threat to US security in basically an analogous way to liberation movements across the world, and sees this as sort of a moment of solidarity against US empire that I hope we can kind of hold with and be inspired by in the future. And kind of on that note, I wanted to draw out some of the other things that I think are really important to learn and hold, particularly these middle two bullets of, I think, the importance of interrogating news, including like mainstream liberal media, for the role that it might play in perpetuating these racialized, gendered, and class notions of terror and security. And then I think also the hope of building alternative structures of education, media, and information sharing as a way to be with each other and build resistance against the narratives that are often forced on movements. And on that thread, kind of the next step within this project for me is to share out through lesson plans, public projects, kind of a curation of a lot of the work that I did this summer. And I'm really excited that there's a few possibilities for a number of intergenerational conversations between movement elders and young people with a lot of these materials that I hope kind of sets a precedent for moving out of the archive and thinking through the possibilities of kind of a solidarity against kind of the news and language of terror. And finally, I wanted to just give a lot of thanks and gratitude and appreciation to the Royce cohort, to Jesus and Maggie, to my mentor, Professor Augusto, and especially to my friends and comrades, with whom I've learned and organized with in Seattle and Providence and at Brown. I really hope that this project can mean something as we build toward collective safety. And I am very excited to end my presentation and announce Yohan's presentation on the Rich Man's Road. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much, Leela, for that great presentation. Hi, my name is Yohan, I use he, him pronouns, and I am interested in highways. This past summer, I spent time thinking and learning about what an ongoing highway construction in Kenya's capital city, Nairobi, revealed about the Kenyan state's approach to development and the consequence of this approach on society and the environment. So a bit of background information about myself and this project. I am Kenyan. Nairobi is one of the many places that I call home. And when I was thinking about creating a Royce Fellowship project, I started thinking to my experiences living and learning both at Brown, but also in Nairobi. And this highway was being constructed at the time. I remember being there over winter break at the beginning of its construction and driving from the airport back home after I'd come back from winter break. And I'm thinking, my goodness, this thing is so massive, it's so visible, and no one seems to be talking about it, or at least how I perceived it to be, is that people weren't talking about it. And then at that point, I'd already taken introductory development studies. I'm a development studies concentrator. And one thing we looked at was transport and transportation and infrastructure, specifically how and why people tend to focus more so on the things that are being moved. So when we're looking at pipelines, we're thinking about oil. When we're thinking about railway lines, we're thinking about trains. When we're thinking about roads, we're thinking about cars. But we don't focus on the actual thing that is facilitating the moving. So in this case, it's the highway. So I thought, why don't I do exactly that and think about what this highway means for development, both in Kenya and then by extension, development policies across post-colonial states, because we're seeing a trend, and I observe a trend of large mega infrastructure projects being quite prioritized by governments across Africa and Southeast Asia and Latin America. So this expressway is the first of its kind in East and Central Africa. It's an elevated expressway for part of its route. It runs 27 kilometers from the southern end of the city of Nairobi to the northern end of the city of Nairobi, from the airport out to the north. It's a public-private partnership. So what this means is the government is only footing about 25% of the cost. The remainder of the cost is through investors, and it's an investment company in China. And they expect to recoup their investment by tolling the road. So people will actually have to pay to use the road. And the first such road in the entire country. The government claims that it will cut travel time in the city from 1 to 2 hours to about 30 minutes. And it is one of the president's key legacy projects. Now, to situate the project spatially, I have two maps here. On the left-hand side of my screen, we have a map of Kenya, and in the center, you see the capital city, Nairobi. So this highway forms one of the most important transport corridors in East Africa. So from the coastal city of Mombasa, which is my hometown where I was born, down to the northwest into the landlocked countries in East Africa. So we're looking at Uganda, South Sudan, Rwanda, Burundi, the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. So it is significant in that sense. And then now when we look at it in the city on the right-hand side, this is actually one of the few maps that I found. It's from a notice from the Kenya National Highways Authority saying that, oh, there's going to be traffic disruptions at this in this area. So it starts at the airport in the south and cuts quite literally right through the center of the city and comes out on the northern end at a junction called James Gishuru, and then continues on to Uganda, and so on. What's interesting now about this is that while it fits into a wider context of moving people and moving goods from the coast into landlocked areas, when we're looking at it in the context of the city, it's also separating. It cuts the city quite literally right into two parts. And it is a physical barrier because it is elevated, a wall, if you may. And I was interested in exploring these much more. So how did I go about doing this? First thing is I tried to situate the project and situate Kenya and Kenya's context within wider theories of development. Whether I agreed with them or whether I disagreed with them is a different story, but kind of fit into this conventional narrative of development as moving through stages, where Kenya is a country that is set for takeoffs, this modernization theory, and a project such as this is one that will push Kenya into the next stage of a roaring economy, moving away from agriculture and focusing on manufacturing because we're moving goods. Then I was looking at information on the project itself, so looking at contracts, looking at the terms of the public-private partnership agreement, looking at studies that had been done, so environmental impact assessments, traffic assessments on the impact of the project. And then I was looking at the history of Nairobi to situate the project also from a temporal perspective. How does this fit into the trajectory of Nairobi growing as a city that has colonial origins? It was built as a stopover midway from the railway line from Mombasa to Uganda by the British in the late 1800s, to today, a city that is now claiming to be, or the government says that it's a hub for business, for tourism, for transportation, and has significance not just for Kenya, but also for the entire region. So what this means in that context as well. Then I focus on now a lot more primary sources, so stuff that wasn't directly related to the project. So I was looking at a lot of maps, maps from the colonial times, maps from the present day. Try to go into the archives of Kenya to look for documents from the British colonial times. It was terribly difficult, was horribly disorganized. I said, I'll come back here another time. And then transportation master plans. So master plans for how Nairobi would have developed as a city when it was first built when it first came into being in the late 1800s to today. And how this integrates, to say, with mass transit and so on. And then probably my favorite part of researching this was the internet. Kenya has a really vibrant internet culture. It has a very fascinating cross-section of the entire population of people just sharing their views. And one of the most interesting things that I found is that there's a forum called Skyscraper City, and it is an infrastructure forum. So it's just people who talk about buildings and roads and airports and railways and so on. So there was a thread specifically on this project that was several hundred pages long that I found very rich information of infrastructure aficionados talking about the project, its impact, what it means, what their perspectives on it. People would go around and take pictures on the ground and post these pictures on, and people say, oh, thank you so much for posting those, they're really good. So study that. Second thing was Twitter. I already spent a lot of time on Twitter myself. So this was nice. But in terms of getting immediate personable reactions, people's lived experiences with the construction of the highway, I turned to Twitter. It is probably one of the more critical spaces in Kenya in terms of people critiquing the government and critiquing the project. That was where I found most of the lines of inquiry that I thought were kind of counter narratives to the narrative the government was putting forth. And then on a marketing perspective, so the government also does get onto Twitter and post images of the project, the pictures of the president while he's touring and inspecting the project. And so analyzing these news articles. And then it was actually through Twitter and these forums that I got many of my interviews, talking to civil engineers, talking to activists, talking to environmental activists to glean what their perspectives were on this project, which led me to a few key findings. Firstly, there was a large emphasis on the aesthetic. This is an image that was posted by the ruling party, the Jubilee Party, and it is an image of the highway construction project, and it is captioned, is this Kenya or is this Europe? Kind of equating this image of modernity as something that can only be seen in Europe, and that it's an exception that this government has been able to do it in Kenya. The second thing is a lot of these images that the government was posting were all bird's eye view pictures, which I found interesting because virtually nobody experiences the highway like this. Everyone experiences the highway, especially right now, from underneath where you can't see. And the state of the road down there is actually quite deplorable. It's almost impassable in some places because it's been destroyed by construction material, the ongoing construction process with all of the large, heavy vehicles. destroying it. And what happens also in Kenya, and I kind of linked it to another infrastructure project that was being completed exactly 5 years ago during election time, which was the railway line being built from the coastal city of Mombasa to the capital city of Nairobi. And it's always around election time. And this is the visual representation of a progress in the government's eyes that is being spread to Kenyans. And this is that vision. This is progress, and this is modernity right here. The second thing is development at any cost. It was estimated that about 2,500 trees were cut down in the process of the construction of this road. These were trees that have been growing, I think, since before independence in 1963. Indigenous trees, significant trees. The government claimed, actually, no, we are going to be transplanting the trees and putting them somewhere else, which was not true. I talked to someone else who told me, just look at the way the trees are being cut down. It actually reveals that these are trees that are not going to be transplanted because they've been cut off without the roots. The second one is traffic jams. This is an image that I found on Twitter of people that were driving home at the end of the day, end of a work day, and actually had to spend the night on the road because the construction caused some of the worst traffic jams that we've ever seen in the city of Nairobi. And the government said, oh, it's only just for the time being. But really, we had experiences of people that live on the southern end of the city, getting home at 4 o'clock in the morning, showering, eating, and then driving back and going back to work. Is the kind of sort of violence, I think, that the government has put in place, what government is causing while constructing this project. Like I said earlier, the road below is almost impassable in some places, but if you can tell from the image that cars are driving on the left-hand and right-hand side of the road. And the cost is almost always described in monetary terms. A lot of the critique of the project is, oh, it's expensive, it's expensive, it's expensive, which is true. The cost has ballooned from about $2 billion now to almost $10 billion. And the cost itself, people are saying, this money could have been redirected into something else, but we don't consider the social cost because it's difficult to quantify. And finally, it continued the colonial logics of separation and extraction. This map shows Nairobi by income. The darker areas are areas that are lower income, and the lighter areas are areas that are higher income. And it has colonial origins because the western side of the city is where has higher well-draining soils, a lot of trees, the climate is actually cooler. And the right-hand side, the eastern side of the city is exactly the opposite, much more barren, much hotter. So during the colonial times, the European settlers would live on the western side of the city, and the Africans would live on the eastern side of the city. At independence, when the settlers left, the wealthier Africans moved to the western side, and the low-income Africans lived on the eastern side. And this highway is a physical barrier that runs through this line, this dotted line, that is essentially the poverty line that shows where a majority of the wealthy and the poorer live. And the highway is a physical barrier for that. The aspect of it being told demonstrates that it's a road for the rich, is that people have to pay to use that road, even though 70% of Nairobi residents commute by walking, and then the remaining 20% commute using public buses. The remaining 10% are those that use cars. Another is a focus on cargo. The government expects investors to recoup their investments through charging high toll fees for cargo. And it does come at the expense of mass transit because there's no provision for mass transit on this highway, despite it being a major corridor for the movement of people in the city. So those are the three main things that I found. What did I learn? Firstly, I think research is not a linear process. I now like to think of it as a web of forming a lot of different connections. And I think throughout this entire process, it was a process of forming connections between things that I thought were disparate and not connected. The second thing is that we really have a need to bolster African scholarship. Comparatively, so little is available. And so little is available that's critical. A lot of what I found was research that was done by people from Europe and from the United States, from the Western world coming in. And I think it's particularly powerful to have someone living this experience, to be studying it and engaging with it, like what I was doing. In terms of getting research and material, especially the historical work that I tried to do, there was just so little that was available. I just didn't know where to find it. I was really helped by my mentor that pointed me in the right direction and started connecting me with people. But in terms of accessibility, it's just so hard. And I had the privilege of having these connections, having someone who knew people to connect me to the resources that I needed. Finally, it was patience. It took so long to either schedule calls with people or to read or to gain, a good foundational understanding of what I was doing. And it was so imperative for me, I think, embrace the process and ease into it and ease into this process of learning. And finally, I think, is being observant. This project came to me because I was sitting in a car one day and I was looking outside the window. I thought that would be an interesting thing to look at. And when I was in Kenya over the summer, I spent a lot of time while I was driving around the city, looking around, being observant, seeing what was around me, and using these as stimuli to formulate my ideas. And I think that's one key thing that is often a bit underrated. There's already so much existing around where we are. So looking ahead, there's a picture of the president actually on an inspection tour. He chastised the environmental activists that were claiming the trees were being cut down because he pointed and turned the camera to the highway and said, look, the trees are still there. When in truth, if you actually look the other direction of the lens, because I've been to this area, you see the trees being cut down. So a big question is what will happen once the highways ended. I speculated a lot on what the circumstances will be just because it hasn't been opened, but we're curious to then extend this project once it is in action, see how citizens feel about, see how people are feeling about it. Extending this to other contexts, to other mega infrastructure projects, not just in Kenya, but also in the region and in other parts of the world. And also a bit more empirically, a study on the highway's effectiveness, did it do what the government said it was going to do? And then also looking now more deeply at the cost of this. I think it's one thing to look at it at the construction stage, but I think another thing once it's been built and it's going to be operated by this Chinese company for 30 years, and look at it on a longer time horizon. And finally, my advice is passion is absolutely key for the Royce Fellowship. It's so important to make these connections, and your idea already exists. The idea is there. So I'd like to conclude by saying thank you all so much. Thank you to Jesus, thank you to Maggie, the other Royce Fellows, my faculty advisors, my mentors, Steve Bloomfield and Alia. Your advice has been invaluable in helping put this project together, and hopefully you might even turn into my senior thesis. So I would now like to introduce Olivia Maliszewski, presenting on Waltham MA Prospect Hill Park Community Mural, The Artificiality of Borders.
Hi, everyone. Let me just share my screen. Thank you, Yohan, for introducing me and for that wonderful presentation. Okay, hello, everyone. My name is Olivia Maliszewski. I am a senior at Brown studying science, technology, and society, and I am an artist. This is a picture of me covered in paint during the creation of my Royce project last summer. So as you can probably infer, I created a public mural called the Waltham, Massachusetts Prospect Hill Park Community Mural, or also known as the Artificiality of Borders. So first I'll talk a little bit about just finding the site that I picked for this mural. So I spent weeks and weeks of time communicating with several different sites, including Providence, Boston, Lexington, different towns around the area. And I finally settled on Prospect Hill Park in Waltham, Massachusetts for a couple different reasons. So the first reason I chose this location is because it was in the next town over from the town I live in while I'm not studying at Brown. So it's very easily accessible to me. And it's a place I grew up in and I'm very familiar with. And I also chose it because it is, obviously it's a park, so it's surrounded by nature, lots of walking paths, lots of trees, animals, birds, butterflies, which I found was ideal for my message of environmental awareness that I wanted to convey with my mural. Furthermore, it's a free public park and it has an area for children and families. So as you can see, there's a picture of me standing next to the site where I painted the mural, this large white door. And in front of the door, there are 4 of these little carnival rides for children. And in the area, there's also a mini golfing area set up. So that just meant that obviously it would get lots of foot traffic and be widely seen and hopefully inspire interest for nature and art in the young people that passed by. And lastly, Waltham is also home to many immigrant communities, which I really wanted to make an homage to in my piece. So that's another reason why I chose Waltham as the site. So now I'll talk a bit about the research and the design behind the mural. So in terms of research, I had many different discussions with the Waltham Park Ranger and the Waltham Recreation Department staff about what they would like to see reflected in a mural in their community. And to make sure, it's really important when I'm doing a community-based research and a community-based project, not to just come into the community and impose my own narratives on them and kind of just paint whatever I want. I really wanted to focus on finding out what the community really wanted to see reflected in a mural. So to do this, I made 2 community feedback flyers in English and also in Spanish. And they basically had a barcode on them that you could just scan with your phone. It led you to a survey and asked people what they'd like to see in a mural. So I pasted these around other public parks in Waltham. I put them up in local businesses like pastry shops and laundromats and gas stations, anywhere that would get foot traffic. And this was really wonderful because it allowed me to interact with local business people and have like lots of wonderful conversations with them in English and Spanish. And there were even shop owners who spoke languages that I didn't know that were kind enough to let me paste my flyers in their shops. So after getting the feedback, I created 3 different designs and sent them to the mayor of Waltham, who chose this design in the corner. So as you can see, it's 2 children's hands sharing a monarch butterfly in front of a purple and blue background. So to quote the direct feedback that I got from the community members and the citizens of Waltham, they wanted to see a design that was colorful, multicultural, and that showcased diversity, acceptance, and community. So this is what I tried to portray in my design. And I also wanted to use the monarch butterfly as a symbol for the immigrant communities in Waltham. As I mentioned before, I think obviously the monarch butterfly travels up to 3,000 miles migrating every year from North America to Mexico. And I think a lot of the times when we're talking about animal migration and society, people are always in awe and amazed about it. But then when we talk about human migration, there's always a strange atmosphere of content that happens. So I wanted to choose the monarch butterfly as a symbol that migration is natural because it just flies over so many man-made borders with ease. And I wanted to show that, yeah, migration is so important for humans and animals. And I also wanted to use the monarch butterfly as a focal point in this piece because as of 2020, it's been listed as one of the endangered species. So with this focus, I wanted to inspire, again, pride in the immigrant community and also awareness for conservation efforts. So now I'm just going to talk about the mindset behind the process. It's really important to me to work from a specific mindset while I'm painting. I try to work from like a decolonial mindset. So what that means to me is I try to take things at a very relaxed pace while working and not rush myself. I am never afraid to get paint all over me and become one with the work. As you can see in the picture, there's paint all over my shirt, it usually gets on my skin and my face. So I just find that that helps me get really involved with what I'm creating. It's crucial to me to bring community, conversation, and friends into the space. So I just think that brings a lot of good energy if I can have people that I know around me. And because the park happened to be closed for maintenance while I was doing this piece, and because of COVID, I wasn't allowed to open the process up to the whole community, but I was able to invite a couple people and put on some music, have fun. And I just find that that usually puts a lot of good energy into the creation. And I think that's something that's really tangible in the outcome. So in summation, I try to focus a lot on the process just as much as the outcome, because I think that's really critical for creating a good work of art. And before I switch to the next slide, I also just want to kind of iterate that art is work. I think today in society, we kind of tend to think of artists as non-essential workers, and that's a notion that I kind of want to reverse. Obviously, painting this mural was a full body effort. My hands got very sore. I was definitely tired after doing it, and so much research and love went into the creation. And I think that's really, really important to remember. So now I'll just talk a little bit about the general process. So this is the finished piece. And what I started with was just obviously cleaning the surface with soap and water and making sure that it was dried fully before I went on to put paint on it. And then I just spray painted down a base layer of primer. This is critical, especially for murals that are outside, just to make sure the paint clings to the surface well. And then I sketched the design using the grid method and just a regular graphite pencil. So the grid method is basically when you step back 10 or 20 feet away from the piece and envision a grid that goes across the surface. Some artists like to actually draw this grid with pencil. Some artists like to put nails in the wall and make the grid with string. But I found that for this piece, just envisioning it in my mind was perfectly fine. And I just do that, to portion out the mural and make sure I'm getting the proportions correctly. So, of course, it's important to be constantly stepping back and not rushing the process. And after I had everything sketched out, I blocked out all the colors. So I started with the monarch butterfly and the hands in this piece, obviously, just because they're all in the foreground. And then after putting down the colors, I just outlined everything in black paint and went in to create the background with the blue and purple paint. So as I mentioned, it's so important to enjoy myself and bring community into the process, but that also means taking frequent breaks for food and water, making sure I'm not experiencing any burnout. And strangely enough, it's really important to lay on the ground or look at the mural upside down when you're creating pieces like this, just because that gives you a fresh perspective on the work. And I tried to appreciate the sun and nature around me, really just dwell in the process, and took a lot of times to stretch my hands. So after everything was dry and all the layers of paint were down, I sealed the mural with 2 coats of spray paint just to make sure that it would be fine through the rain and the snow and whatever weather we experienced. Then I signed my work and edited a video of some clips that I took while creating the mural, which you'll see at the end of this presentation. But before I move on to the video, I want to just talk a little bit about why I chose the Royce Fellowship. So the Royce Fellowship was a perfect match for me just because it allowed me freedom in every single aspect of the research project. As a creative person and an artist, I find a lot of the times in academic spaces, it's hard to find a program that will allow you to bring creativity and art into your process. So the Royce did this flawlessly, and that was something that was really, really important to me. The Royce Fellowship also allowed me a high level of independence in conceptualizing and executing my project, but at the same time, it also offered me many outlets of support, such as the Royce cohort, which was always there for me to bounce ideas off of, Jesus and Maggie, who were always available through email or ready to meet with me over Zoom if I had any concerns or questions, and my 2 faculty advisors, Professor Caldwell and Professor Sobral, who were with me during the entire process and provided an immense amount of support. Additionally, I found that the Royce was well funded and secure. I was able to purchase high quality supplies that will last a long time, and much more that was just necessary along the way. And in general, I just found that it was a great opportunity for collaboration and community engagement. So I would really urge people to apply. And lastly, I just want to do some important acknowledgements. This project absolutely would not have been possible without the gracious support of Charles Royce, Jesus and Maggie, the Royce cohort, Adam Green, Ruth Caldwell, Patricia Sobral, John and Rena Maliszewski, and of course, the town of Waltham. Thank you all so much. And now I will show you the video. All right, thank you so much everyone for watching. And now I'd like to introduce Alison Swinth, who will be talking about kin making in public housing.
Hi everyone, let me just share my screen super quickly. All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Alison Swinth. I am a senior studying anthropology here at Brown. And this project is not only my Royce project, but my senior thesis and the culmination of over 4 years of thinking, writing, and ranting about the New York City Housing Authority, or NYCHA, as it is lovingly called by housing wonks and tenants alike. So I just want to start out by walking you through some of my research questions. So my research question is, how do NYCHA policies which determine who belongs in public housing affect the kin-making practices of tenants? Who enacts these policies, and what kinds of power structures do they produce? How do tenants create space for alternative power structures? And this question can be a little bit jargony, so I want to break down what I mean when I say certain things. So the first thing that may jump out at you is the idea of kin-making practices. And in order to understand that, we need to understand what I mean when I say kin. And so for this, I'm borrowing a definition from the feminist scholar Donna Haraway, who says, by kin, I mean those who have enduring, mutual, obligatory, non-optional, you can't just cast that away when it gets inconvenient, enduring relatedness that carries consequences. I have a cousin, the cousin has me. I have a dog has me. And so if that's what I mean when I say kin, when I'm talking about kin-making practices, I'm talking about the things that we all do in our day-to-day lives that create, strengthen, maintain those relationships. And for the purposes of this project, I'm really thinking about those things that happen in the home and for which the home is required. So those are things like hosting people at your house for a huge holiday dinner. Those are also things like opening up your home for periods of months or weeks or just a couple days to family members who need a place to stay. And especially opening your home is just huge kin-making practice. And then when I'm talking about power in this context, I'm really talking about who gets to determine who belongs in public housing and how those people should live. Who should live together, who should share a bedroom, who should do the dishes, who should work, all of these decisions that are both made personally, and then also there are other power structures which impose certain answers to those decisions. So going back to my research question, what I'm really trying to do is tease out how people live together and what different kinds of actors are playing around with that and are having a say in that in public housing, and especially with the interaction of housing and the welfare state, which is unique and happens in public housing. And I set about to answer this question through kind of a mixed methods, two-pronged approach. So on the one hand, I did a lot of archival research. So I looked at historical archives about the beginning of the Public Housing Authority, but I also looked at current day documents, things like leases, things like tenant selection plans, management manuals. And then I also conducted some quantitative data analysis using the data that the authority makes available about its tenants. I compiled literature on the topic, and then I also conducted 10-hour-long ethnographic interviews, 7 of which were with current NYCHA tenants, one of whom is also a really influential housing activist. So I interviewed her in kind of 2 capacities. And then I also conducted 3 ethnographic interviews with lawyers who work with NYCHA tenants. And then I also did an analysis of 7 oral histories of residents of Queensbridge houses, which is the largest public housing development in New York. So I want to start at the beginning of the story when the New York State government first created NYCHA. And I'm starting here because understanding the initial goals of the authority was crucial for me in understanding how it functions today and specifically what kinds of families it hopes to house. So in 1934, the New York State government decided it was going to take the issue of housing into its own hands, and specifically it was going to clear out the quote unquote slums, by which they meant the tenement houses. And this kind of had 2 dimensions to it, right? So we're talking about New Deal era, where there was this belief that it is the job of the government to provide safe housing to its citizens. And this was a pretty radical belief new at the time. that the government should ensure that all citizens have a working kitchen, have a working bathroom. But on the other side of this coin, there was also a lot of moralistic assumptions about people who lived in the quote unquote slums. And there was a lot of fears about things like sexual promiscuity, about things like non-traditional family structures, about things like participation in the informal versus formal economy. And so the purpose of creating public housing was not only to take into the government's hands where people lived, but also to create housing that would ensure a nuclear kind of heteronormative two-parent family structure, as opposed to this kind of immoral view that they had of people who were living in tenement housing. And NYCHA reiterated these principles about appropriate family structures virtually every decade since the 1930s. For example, there were 21 moral factors which were used to evaluate applicants from 1953 to 1968. And a lot of these quote unquote moral factors had to do with out of wedlock children, poor housekeeping, all of these kinds of things. So while NYCHA wished people would live how they thought they should, tenants had their own ideas. And my project really investigates this ongoing tension between how tenants want to live, or how tenants do live, in their own practices of kin making, and NYCHA's ideas in the contemporary setting. So to this day, NYCHA has strict regulations about who constitutes family. And you may have guessed it looks pretty nuclear. So siblings, parents, grandparents, these are family in NYCHA's view. They can be moved into your apartment. But cousins, uncles, aunts, these are not family, and they cannot be moved into your apartment. And this is quite literally laid out in the tenant selection plan. And my work, my interviews and my ethnographic work really aligns with a lot of the kind of like big work in the field from scholars such as Patricia Hill Collins and Carol Stack, who argued that in low-income communities, and especially in low-income communities of color, in Black and Latinx communities, kin networks tend to be more dynamic and non-nuclear, that there are extensive networks of mutual aid and care, which really can't be encompassed in this very strict definition which the authority imposes. So for example, there is higher levels of multi-generational living, and this is certainly supported by some of the things that my interviewees said to me. A lot of them mentioned that they had lived with parents through most of their life, caring for their parents as they aged. They spoke about living with siblings and siblings' families through adulthood. And there's also this practice of child keeping, which is what Carol Stack calls it in her ethnography, All Our Kin. And this is essentially a practice of someone's child living with someone else who's not necessarily the parents for a few months, a year, let's say, as a way of kind of collective childcare. And this is something that some of my tenants echoed experiencing as well. For example, one tenant mentioned that she had taken in her son's best friend in adolescence for a few months when he was having a tough time and kind of needed a change of scene. And this idea of collective childcare, more extensive networks, opening your space to people when they need it, was just reiterated time and time again to me. And it's also demonstrated in this widespread practice of ghost tenancy. So ghost tenancy is essentially when someone lives in a New York City public housing apartment without officially being on the lease. And estimates of how many ghost tenants there are really vary, but it goes from 100,000 to 200,000 tenants living as quote unquote ghosts. And just for context, there's about 400,000 tenants who live legally in NYCHA apartments. So we're talking about 25 to 50% more people living in the public housing authority than is represented in the leases. So this is an incredibly widespread phenomenon, and is really indicative of the ways that this limited view of kinship really fails families and doesn't work for the way that people are actually organizing themselves. And this dovetails really nicely into the idea of desirability. So not only does the authority push families to adhere to a nuclear heteronormative family model, but they also make decisions about who is appropriate kin to have around. So they also make decisions about who is desirable to have in your family, and take it upon themselves to remove family members who they view as non-desirable. And non-desirability usually comes about in the context of an arrest, and that's usually when a non-desirability proceeding, which is an eviction proceeding, will take place. And you can't separate the fact that this happens in the context of arrests from the well-studied, well-documented phenomenon of mass incarceration of Black and Latino men and men of color in general. And we cannot kind of pull this out from the fact that this is a like systematic pulling Black and Latino men out of their kin networks in public housing and making it difficult for them to participate in their family and preventing kin making in that regard. And so I kind of wanted to walk through what a non-desirability proceeding can look like, because I think it's really important to highlight different moments of power as these non-desirability proceedings take place. So first, what might happen is a household member is arrested and the NYPD will report this event to NYCHA. So an interesting thing here is that theoretically, the NYPD is just supposed to report to NYCHA any instance where someone has been arrested on a NYCHA complex or who puts down their primary address as a NYCHA address. The data shows that they actually don't report this a majority of the time, which also emphasizes some of the power that an individual police officer may have in this circumstance to decide whether they want this arrest to affect or jeopardize this person's housing, right? So this police officer then makes this choice to report this to the public housing authority and jeopardize this person's housing. And then it gets passed on to the housing manager, who will basically, there's a bunch of different little processes that happen here where it gets passed on, they recommend for eviction. There's this kind of mini investigation, which mostly involves talking to the police officer and the housing manager. And I really want to emphasize here how much power the housing manager has in these circumstances. There's a lot of conversation that happens behind closed doors where the housing manager may say, honestly, I don't want this tenant living here because they are constantly complaining to me about maintenance issues, and I would rather them get kicked out. And that is genuinely stuff that happens behind the scenes. So the housing manager here has a lot of influence. And then it moves on to housing court, or more likely it moves on to a stipulation. So this is essentially where NYCHA lawyers will offer to the family, this can go away if you agree to these terms. And this term is usually going to be a permanent exclusion, which is when someone is not allowed to even walk onto the premises of a NYCHA complex. And you can imagine how much this disrupts processes of family making when your family member is literally not allowed to go to your apartment. So one example is of a 23-year-old man who was found to have a firearm in his car, and he was living with his mother, and his mother had to make the decision to exclude him because she had to choose between a relationship with her son or her housing. And that's an incredibly common situation. So I've kind of discussed this vision of desirability, who is desirable, and I've talked about the authority constantly asserting answers to the question, who belongs in public housing. But I think a question that is also incredibly fraught is tenants themselves asking, who do I want in my community? And this is a question that has a lot of different answers depending on who you ask, right? It has much less to do with who is and is not legally on the lease or who has what specific kin relationship to whom, but it's much more about how is this person treating the space? Do I feel safe with this person? Are they participating in community building activities? Do they make me, do I feel like I could let them watch my children? And answers to these questions vary a lot. So this is also a contested space. So you have older tenants who may more often say, I don't really want someone who has a gun living next to me because I have fears of this and that, or I don't want this person living next to me because I don't see them consistently greeting me, participating in this community. But you may have other tenants who say, that person looks like my grandson, that person looks like my son, that person looks like my friend, and I want them in this community. And so questions of who belongs here are not simple, and they vary a lot. It did seem that people were more critical. There was this sense that housing should be shared among families. So people tended to be more critical of ghost tenants who were friends rather than family. And I think in this case, they were generally using a more broad definition of family just based on who they mentioned that they had lived with. So they were entirely comfortable with aunts, uncles, godparents, but they seemed a little bit more suspicious of younger tenants in particular, living with younger people. So I kind of want to get back to my initial question, which had to do with power. And when I first started this research, I had envisioned a really simple model of power that looked like two arrows, and one is the state, and then one is tenant resistance, and they meet each other, and it's super simple. And then as I did my research, I ended up with something that looked a little bit more like this knot of power with lots of different people with different interests, and power that comes from lots of different things, power that may come from respect from tenants versus from the law. And I kind of began to think more about a tenant living in public housing with their family as moving through this knot of power and interacting with these different actors along the way in ways that were advantageous to them to create space for their family. And that became the model that was more prevalent to me in thinking about this. So these are my concluding questions, and where is this research going? This is my thesis research, so I'm still thinking about this for another 2 months at least. So I don't really have my conclusion written yet. But I do have a lot of questions. So I think the first thing I want to emphasize is that the stakes are high in excluding someone from public housing. Most often, it is going to end with the person experiencing homelessness or housing insecurity. So the question of creating a selective community, or a community that lives by a certain set of norms, or a community that does X, Y, or Z becomes a lot more complicated when someone not being part of that community likely means homelessness or housing insecurity. And so I think that adds a new level of complication to those questions. And it also emphasizes that this isn't just a NYCHA problem, but it is a larger problem with an unaffordable city, with a lack of jobs, a lack of resources, with the criminal legal system, and all of these things. I also want to emphasize that this issue becomes a lot more complicated with the ongoing efforts of the state to privatize public housing, essentially to give tenants fewer and fewer protections. So these are kind of some lingering questions about what this issue may look like moving forward. And so the final product of my research will be both a thesis and a website. Many tenants expressed to me that they felt a lot safer in their housing when they knew their rights, and they knew what their housing manager was allowed to say to them and wasn't allowed to say to them. So hopefully I want to put together something where more tenants can feel like they know their rights and know how to protect themselves. And then I just want to highlight some of these amazing resources that I found super helpful, and people who are really thoughtful on these issues, especially on privatization. I want to highlight the One NYCHA podcast, which is a Facebook Live podcast that happens every Sunday. This is a group of tenants who are all really involved in the community and talk through NYCHA issues every single week. There are organizations fighting NYCHA privatization. I listed some of them there. I've actually highlighted Fight for NYCHA because they are currently suing the Housing Authority and are asking for funds for their legal funds. And then some lawyers who keep people in their housing through the Legal Aid Society or Brooklyn Defender Services. And then to finish off, I just want to say thank you to everyone for being here. My wonderful advisor, Professor Lina Weaver, my anthropology thesis cohort, my family and friends, some of whom are here, Maggie and Jesus, the Royce Fellowship, and then of course, the wonderful Royce cohort, one of whom will be presenting right now. So I am very excited to introduce Ari Lunow-Luke, who will be presenting on Asian settler Aloha Āina, envisioning solidarities through relationships to land on Oahu, Hawaii.
Thanks, Allison. Okay, let me figure out screen sharing. Perfect. Can everyone see my presentation? Okay, cool. Let me just move you. Okay. Perfect. Hi, I'm Ari, and I'll be presenting on also some of my senior thesis work on Asian settler Aloha Āina, where I've been envisioning solidarities through relationships to land in Hawaii. So I want to recognize that Brown's campus and the lands we are currently standing on are the homelands of the Narragansett peoples. Brown has played a significant role in the violence and erasure of Indigenous peoples in what is now known as Rhode Island. And our occupation of these lands actively contributes to ongoing colonialism. While my project focuses on land stewardship and native land rights in Hawaii, I want to acknowledge the many environmental injustices Narragansett peoples also face in the present, such as the mercury pollution threatening the Schoolhouse Pond and Deep Pond on the Narragansett Reservation that provide food and drinking water to many Narragansett communities. I recognize that land acknowledgements are inherently imperfect and the bare minimum in the context of decolonization, and continue to educate myself on Narragansett histories, culture, and fights for self-governance. I also want to recognize the Kanaka Maoli lands where I conducted my research, which I've occupied since birth and that my family has occupied for 4 generations before me. I want to recognize the ongoing US occupation and colonization of Hawaii and the impacts that tourism, militarization, and imperialism continue to have on the Hawaiian people and the lands they are ancestrally tied to. The sacred Mauna Kea continues to face desecration, and the Navy storage tanks on the Red Hill continue to contaminate freshwater resources for Hawaii. I stand behind the Kia'i, or protectors, who continue to fight for Native people and places in Hawaii, and acknowledge that Hawaiian histories and epistemologies are crucial in my work to learn about and understand Hawaii. I continue to unsettle myself by reflecting on what it means to call Hawaii home when I am not Indigenous to it. So again, I want to recognize that I am not Native. I was born and raised in Kailua on the island of Oahu. As I mentioned before, I am the 5th generation on the Chinese side of my family to reside in Hawaii, making myself and my family longtime settlers. Much of my approach to this work has been informed by my personal experiences growing up in Hawaii, and I'm constantly sitting with tensions of studying issues relating to indigeneity in this work and continue to reflect on my positionality throughout this project. So growing up in Asian communities in Hawaii, I was exposed to a lot of narratives about how Hawaii is a melting pot of racial diversity where racism doesn't exist because of the Aloha spirit. Not only do these claims erase the ongoing racism and violence Kanaka Maoli face every day in Hawaii, but they appropriate Native ideas of Aloha to indigenize Asian people to Hawaii. In many ways, I grew up learning that to be from Hawaii is also in many cases to be Asian, which is incredibly flawed. This project was inspired by a groundbreaking collection of essays edited by Candice Fujikane and Jonathan Okamura called Asian Settler Colonialism, where Asian and Native authors theorized the ways in which Asian identifying people have often perpetuated white settler colonialism as a way of assimilating into American democracy. However, many longtime Asian settlers came to Hawaii as a result of plantation labor, where they were forced to work under extremely harsh and racist conditions. In this way, the relationships between Asian and Native people are historically complicated in the sense that when Asian groups first migrated to Hawaii, they experienced similar forms of oppression and were not in positions of political power. But over time, as Asian laborers gained more rights and rose up in American political and economic systems, they became capable of feeding into the same systems of white colonialism that continue to oppress Native communities. Based on these complex and interwoven histories, I was interested in not only increasing awareness of Asian settler colonialism in Asian communities in Hawaii, but envisioning paths forward where Asian settlers can work to support Kanaka Maoli in their fights for self-determination. The primary lens I've taken in my approach to envisioning these sorts of solidarities is through relationships to land and place. So first, I wanted to define a couple of terms. So in Olelo, Hawaii, the native language of Kanaka Maoli, the term Āina is used to refer to the landscape. While Āina can be roughly translated to mean land, earth, or soil in English, its more literal translation is that which feeds. So in this way, the term Āina encompasses much more than just the physical land and can therefore not necessarily be described or defined in any other language. Here I have a quote from John Osorio, a Kanaka Maoli scholar and activist, talking about how ai is the word that means to eat. And when we say Āina, we're basically talking about what it is that feeds not just humans, but basically everything. And everything is directly dependent and interdependent with the Āina. So based on this understanding of Āina, we then come to the concept of Aloha Āina, which is the basis of my project. The phrase Aloha Āina is used often and also cannot be fully understood outside of a Kanaka Maoli worldview, but roughly translated, Aloha Āina can figuratively mean love for the land, but it has also been used to refer to acts of Hawaiian patriotism. Thus, Aloha Āina is an indigenous orientation to Hawaii, rooted in the understanding that Kanaka Maoli are the land and the land is Kanaka Maoli. So in the 1970s, during the Hawaiian Renaissance, Aloha Āina was also used by Kanaka Maoli activists to revitalize Hawaiian culture and push back against ongoing settler colonialism and US occupation. Thus, Aloha Āina has also come to represent the movement for self-determination and cultural revitalization, as the Āina is central to Kanaka Maoli identity. So acts of Aloha Āina can take many forms and often involve practices of love and care for Hawaiian land, people, culture, and so on. So here are a couple of images showing examples of acts of Aloha Āina, where people are directly stewarding land or practicing Hawaiian culture. So for my project, I was interested in exploring the possible solidarities and tensions between Asian settler and Kanaka Maoli communities through practices of Aloha Āina. Some questions I had going into this project were, is an Asian settler Aloha Āina even possible? What would it look like in practice? And what role could land stewardship play in fostering solidarities between Asian settler and Kanaka Maoli communities? And what are the responsibilities associated with being a non-native steward of Hawaii? So this summer, with support from the Royce Fellowship, I interviewed 10 Asian and/or Kanaka Maoli identifying land stewards about Asian settler colonialism and what it means to build authentic relationships to land and place. I identified a land steward as anyone who engages with Aloha Āina work in its many forms and holds biocultural knowledge or relationships to Hawaii. I ended up interviewing farmers, scholars, educators, chefs, and cultural practitioners, and really wanted my project to highlight the approaches these individuals take to practicing Aloha Āina in their communities. So one primary concept that came out of my interviews was the fact that a Kanaka Maoli relationship to place is unique and non-replicable, which should be quite obvious. But Kanaka Maoli are ancestrally tied to Hawaii in the sense that the islands and everything that constitutes them are the literal ancestors to the Hawaiian people. This idea is integral to understanding one's position as an Asian settler in the sense that one can never have the exact same relationship to Hawaii that Kanaka Maoli have. Here I have a quote from my interview with Kaleo Wong, a Kanaka Maoli steward of Kauai Nui on the island of Oahu. Western relationship to land is very different than indigenous relationships to land, right? And our stories of how we exist, the same gods who gave birth to the islands, gave birth to us, gave birth to Kalo, gave birth to us as people, and so land is part of our genealogy. It's our responsibility to care for land and to steward land and to grow Kalo. There's a reciprocal relationship to take care of your older brother and your land, and they'll take care of you. Kaleo explains how a Kanaka Maoli genealogy includes the islands and kalo, or the taro plant, a staple food to the Hawaiian people. This understanding makes the ability to care for the land essential to one's identity as a Native person. Fostering an Asian settler Aloha Āina thus involves recognizing and uplifting this unique relationship to place by respecting its importance. It's often hard for settlers to somewhat unsettle themselves by reckoning with the fact that they cannot have this specifically genealogical connection to the lands they occupy. But rather than ignoring this idea or becoming immobilized by it, another theme that came out in almost every interview I conducted was that anyone can still practice Aloha Āina regardless of if you are Native or not. My conversation with Hi'ile Covelo, a Kanaka Maoli fisherwoman at the local ia, or indigenous fish pond at Paipai Ohe'eia, she explained how hard work and good intentions matter more than identity in the context of her Aloha Āina work. We're always just super stoked to get any kind of help where we can find it. And so we don't really tease out or take mental note of what people's different ethnic backgrounds might be. I'd say we take more mental note of if somebody's rotten, like somebody that rolls up and just has a bad attitude or is grossed out. Like those are the kinds of people that we remember more so than the others that just want to come for a really authentic experience. I think a lot of volunteer opportunities kind of take it easy on their volunteers. Like for us, I think we've kind of carved out a niche for ourselves and that people know that when they come to He'eia Fish Pond, it's meaningful work. We're not going to go easy on you. We're going to push you to your limits. And if you cannot handle, then you go find another job for yourself elsewhere. So here, Hi'ile points to how much work there is to be done in the context of land stewardship. And to her, it's more important. It's more about one's willingness and determination to work towards a more just and abundant future for the people of Hawaii than whether or not you're ancestrally from it. Based on this idea, another theme that came out of my interviews was that a kuleana, or responsibility, exists for Asian settlers and any non-Native people occupying Hawaii for that matter to practice Aloha Āina. So Celia Barbell-Jones, a Filipino scholar and activist, commented in her interview how if one doesn't know anything about Hawaiian culture and has lived here for 20 years, that very incuriosity is disturbing, right? How could you live in a place for more than 20 years, for instance, and not be curious about the language, the concepts, the cosmologies, the ways of literally framing one's understanding of a place? Here, Celia explains the weight of responsibility placed on settlers to educate themselves, put in the time and labor to steward Hawaii, and work to uplift Hawaiian culture, language, and people. She notes how after being in Hawaii for a substantial amount of time, it is expected and necessary for one to stand behind Native fights for Hawaii. Something I also found really powerful that came through in some of my interviews, specifically with Asian land stewards, was the idea that practicing Aloha Āina and allying with the Hawaiian community can bring Asian settlers into deeper understandings of their own Asian identities. Mark Noguchi, a Japanese chef and activist, touches on this idea in the quote I have here. I feel very fortunate. I was in school in the 90s during this really important time in the Hawaiian Studies department. And I always knew, though, in my head, I'm not Hawaiian. I know that. I'm fine with that. Were there times in college that it was kind of hard to figure out where my place was? Of course. Because also during that time, I had Ku'e classmates that always wanted to make sure to remind me, hey, don't forget, yeah, we're glad you're here, but you're not Hawaiian. I'm real lucky that I didn't channel that into an insecurity somehow. I guess I kind of realized like, that's okay. And then inevitably being proud of being associated with my Hawaiian community also made me proud of being Japanese. Mark notes how constantly recognizing one's positionality while working hard to uplift Native communities that are secure in their identities and culture can lead one to identify more greatly with their own culture and heritage. I'm really interested in this idea and I'm hoping to continue to explore it more in this work. So these are just a couple of snapshots of the powerful, beautiful, important pieces of knowledge these land stewards shared with me this summer. These topics are deeply personal and often rooted in individual stories, so I want to acknowledge that my project can only speak to the thoughts and experiences of the individuals I spoke with. But today, settler colonialism continues to harm Kanaka Maoli communities and places. Activists continue to protest the leaking of Navy fuel storage tanks on Red Hill, as well as the construction of the TMT on Mauna Kea. Many Asian settlers are still complicit in these conflicts and often lack an understanding of what their positions and roles are in colonial systems. Using the explorations from this project, I'm hoping to continue to envision what solidarities could look like between Asian settler and Kanaka Maoli communities, and continue to embark on a personal exploration of what my role is and how I relate to land and place in Hawaii. So lastly, I just want to say a big mahalo, big thank you to all the land stewards that I interviewed who are listed here, as well as my thesis advisor, Kevin Escudero, and impromptu mentor, Makana, and some undergraduate scribers that helped me with interview data, and of course, everyone at the Royce Fellowship for all of their support. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ari, and all the other presenters. We have about 10 minutes for Q&A. So folks can use the chat function, or you can just start speaking and ask a question of any of our brilliant scholars. Thanks, Rena. Go ahead.
Yes, I wanted to say I enjoyed all of the presentations very much. I had a question for Yohan regarding his findings, and am curious if he had the opportunity to share any of those findings with either activists that are perhaps sharing some of the same concerns of the impact of the road work, and whether or not there is a plan to help correct some of the impassable roads that are affecting many people, I'm sure.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I actually don't have time to get into it in terms of like my project evolution. Originally intended that to happen much earlier in the project's process. I wanted it to be like an ongoing back and forth between myself, activists, and people that were concerned with what I found. But I realized there was simply so much more than what I had expected, that there was just the sheer volume of material that I had encountered that I really wanted to take the time to parse through it a bit more. So looking ahead, that is something that I hope to do more explicitly and with a lot more intention, because if I wanted to do it, I wanted to do it right, not just like as an aside. So hopefully when I'm able now to dedicate more time into the project, when I hopefully turn it into my thesis my senior year, is when that will come in. In terms of correcting some of these issues, at the moment, the prospects for doing so, in my view, are quite slim because the project is full steam ahead to get it done before the elections that are happening in August. And the contract itself and the details of it, I was only able to just scratch the surface. A lot of it was kept secretive, and corruption still still continues to be a major problem, I think, in government. So in the short term, I unfortunately don't foresee anything changing more in a material sense, but hopefully in the long term, increasing, a social awareness of the impact of this project will result in at least some of the issues being corrected at present.
Thank you.
Kevin, had a question?
Sure, one second. Hi everyone. So I had a question for Ari, and apologies, I came a little bit late for the other presentations, but Ari, I was just wondering if when you talked with folks in the community, if there were some questions or like concerns like, oh, or hesitation around like talking about these topics of like the role of Asian settlers in standing in solidarity with Kanaka Maoli communities. I guess like were any folks like hesitant or was there like some questioning of like, oh, why this project, why interesting? I just was curious if you had some of those reactions when you talk to folks.
While Ari answers that question, I'm going to encourage the other presenters to answer Kirsten's question in the chat.
Yeah, I definitely expected like a lot of pushback in the interviews. Like I was really nervous and was trying to be really careful about the way that I was framing my questions and was scared that there would be a lot of pushback. But actually people are really excited to talk about the idea of Asian settler colonialism and reframing it in that way. I think if anything, people were just like, oh, like I just haven't talked about that much. Like that's not something that we always talk about. Like it's always about white settler colonialism or like historically. So yeah, I don't think I received that much pushback. I also think like something that is quite nuanced is that like a lot of the Native identifying people that I interviewed were also Asian identifying. It's really common to be mixed, like have mixed ethnicities in Hawaii. So a lot of them were like also kind of grappling with like, oh yeah, like I'm also Chinese, but like more so I'm like also Native. So like also what does that mean? And so yeah, I think that was a really interesting aspect of the project as well.
Just to read Kirsten's question, I'm always curious about your favorite find in your research that didn't make it into your presentation. I'm excited to hear everyone's responses.
I think one thing I was really excited about learning more of this summer was through oral histories and sort of like political movement newspapers, how people define safety and security for themselves and how much of a through line there was of kind of this real recognition that a lot of systems that the state kind of thought of as safety were not how individuals and communities define their own safety, and just how present that was as a discourse and rhetoric.
There were some things that did not make it into my final presentation. Obviously, I had 2 other designs that the mayor voted on, so I can show those now if people are interested. This is one of the other designs that I came up with. So this one's just focusing more on the butterfly. And then this was another one that was also a candidate, but didn't make it.
Are you happy with the one they chose? Is that the one you would have chosen?
Yeah, it is the one I would have chosen. Thank you for asking. I just feel like in terms of, I just think it would have been not the easiest to execute, but like the one that made the most sense to execute, because I feel like it kind of combined aspects of both of the other designs that I wanted to have in the piece.
I have a quick response. I initially tried to draw like a link or comparison between the way the Kenyan state operated and the way the British colonial state operated. And I did find, I think, a few. And that was the genesis of, that was the starting point or the point of departure for the project. But then I realized, dynamics between state and citizens has changed. I mean, the physical makeup of the city changed at independence. The world itself and the context within which the colonial state was operating in the Kenyan state today was different. And just in essence, it was 50, 60 years later. So I decided to kind of shift and look into the future. and make connections rather across time periods, so not ignoring or discounting the colonial state, but I guess considering as part of many factors. So it was that kind of shift to it was what made it into the presentation rather than where I started. Yeah.
I can answer this question, but I also want to make sure that there's time for anyone else to ask questions if there are any other questions. But I don't know if this was my favorite find, but I think a big piece that I didn't put in my presentation was like the ongoing role of maintenance issues and maintenance in people's lives. And to say something that is more uplifting is kind of the culture of community care that I witnessed in terms of maintenance issues. So a lot of people spoke about the authority basically failing to deal with maintenance issues. Like I have a million stories, but a lot of people also spoke about turning to their neighbors to help them with basic plumbing issues that they knew was going to take 3 weeks for the authority to send someone, or whether that be a painting issue, all of these things. So I thought that there's a whole other world of my research about maintenance issues that I have had to limit myself on a little bit. But I thought the culture of kind of community care when it came to maintenance issues was really interesting to me and a really cool thing to find.
I want to recognize we are at time, so if anybody has any other questions, please feel free to ask, or if you have to go, we understand. You can look in the program for the event as well if you want to see videos from the previous days. Alison, I wondered how you came to your project. I feel like a few of the other students or fellows have talked about how they got there, but like, was it housing first or was it kinship structure first that you came to?
I actually have a very distinct, which is why I said over 4 years. So in high school, I worked briefly at a local government, like assembly member's office. And I ended up becoming very good friends or became close to the person who was the housing specialist in the office. And I just basically saw day in and day out an influx of people coming in and talking about their housing issues with public housing. And then part of that was that I was lucky enough to be there at a time that someone from legal aid actually came in to give us a presentation about a bunch of these policies that my research became. And I just remember being incredibly affected and like hearing from this lawyer about all of these things that were going on. And at the same time, seeing tenants coming in and consistently complaining about pretty similar issues. And so kind of since then, I think I've managed to write like 3 different research papers about NYCHA and about families. So it's kind of been a long-term interest of mine that came directly out of that when I worked in that office.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I feel like that connects back to Yohan's observation about being aware of your surroundings and your projects really around you at all times. Well, I think we'll wrap up here. I want to thank everybody for coming out and supporting community engaged research. And we look forward to maybe you attending next year as well. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.